your Principal 340B consultant with Virtue 340B. Welcome back to the next installment of Katy's 340B Compass. I'm glad you're here. If this is your first time joining, welcome. If you are a returning listener or viewer, I appreciate it. Thanks for being here. Today I thought we'd talk about patient definition. So we've definitely touched on this before. It's always a hot topic in the 340B world. It's a core compliance element, for covered entities to be mindful of, or, to make sure that they're managing well within their 340B program, and also something, with other stakeholders that's often a talking point. And I'll get into, why this has become a little bit more of a hot topic lately, but I figured just to level set, we'll just talk quick about, what exactly I mean when I say patient definition, just for those of you that maybe don't live in this space or in the weeds of this space on a daily basis. So patient definition is essentially how each covered entity is defining what an eligible patient is within their covered entity, where they're able to utilize 340B drugs, whether that be a patient within their hospital or their entity, off-site department, somewhere that they're providing care to a patient that they're having, maybe a drug administered in that setting, or a prescription written that might be filled at an outpatient pharmacy or a contract pharmacy and potentially captured as part of the entity's 340B program. It's how you're defining when you will utilize 340B drug for what patient types, or, for what parameters are appropriate for being able to utilize 340B drug. And, this is not well defined in the 340B statute. The shocker, right? Like, there's not much that's super well defined in the 340B program. So, over time, maybe this has evolved some. I want to say that my experience with covered entities is I think that it's certainly not as, widespread or problematic as other stakeholders might portray it as. But I'll say generally, you are, you have the entity has a medical record for this patient. You are providing care for this patient that results in that drug being administered or that prescription being written. And that doesn't always look exactly the same. So maybe it is a very tight, like black and white scenario of you are a hospital, you are caring for this patient, they are, in your rheumatology practice, which is part of your hospital, part of your 340B program, and you're infusing or administering a drug to them. Or this is a patient at your primary care practice that you see them once a year, or maybe every 2 years, because let's be honest, like, just in the world that we live in, we're not all on top of our health care as much as we should be, or maybe we don't have to be that. There's all varying levels of health. So, maybe you see your provider once every year or 2 years, and they manage your prescriptions. So that, constitutes, in my eyes, an eligible patient. Maybe you, again, I'll use the primary care example. Maybe you're a patient at a primary care practice of the covered entity, and you are referred out for that rheumatology care. And, this primary care provider works somewhat in a coordinated or collaborative way with that rheumatologist. It's semi-loose, right? They're managing separate practices. But for this patient, gets referred out from primary care to the rheumatologist writes a prescription, the patient has that prescription filled maybe at the covered entity's pharmacy, or maybe at a contract pharmacy of the covered entity. And because of that, continued care, and the fact that that primary care provider is still following that care provided at the rheumatologist, that too could be considered a 340B eligible. That too could be, within the parameters of that covered entity's patient definition, as referral care. It needs to be, well defined. You need to make sure that that provider, the primary care, the covered entity provider, is truly caring still for that patient, is still responsible for their full care, that includes that rheumatology prescription. Usually that's going to be like a back and forth where, maybe the rheumatologist sends a note back to the primary care provider, so that they're still, when they see that patient, they're going to be, okay, so I know you saw Dr. Smith and they prescribed Humira for you, and how is that going? Because your primary care provider is ultimately responsible for your holistic care. So, that's what I mean, or what is meant by patient definition. How are you defining your patient that they are going to, you're going to be able to support that you're using 340B drug for them in whatever setting that might be. So again, this is not well defined in the statute. So over time, this has evolved of understanding like what HRSA's expectations are. And it's basically what I said, like that the prescription needs to come from an eligible department of the covered entity. The patient needs to be provided care by that department. They can't just be prescribing the medication, or certainly not just dispensing the medication. They need to, have an established medical record. They need to be an established patient. Ideally, you have a medical record that supports the care that led up to this prescription. Their encounter that happened last month, you can see that they noted that the patient's on this prescription. And again, it doesn't always look the same because we have those referrals, but this is how, each covered entity should be mindful in thinking about, how they're defining a patient, and then making sure that they're configuring all of their systems to support that. And I think that generally this is what happens. There's certainly some disruptors that are out there. A couple years ago, we had the Genesis ruling. That was a federally qualified health center in, I believe, South Carolina, in one of the Carolinas. That they felt that they were responsible for any prescription that one of their patients received, regardless of if their providers wrote that prescription, regardless if they had that that closed loop referral process showing that they still were responsible for that care, even if it had been referred out for certain elements. And, they were audited by HRSA. HRSA found that they just really were very loosely defining patient definition. It was essentially if they had a medical record for someone, any prescription they're capturing. And that's my understanding, and maybe I'm overstating that. But, HRSA found issue with what they saw during the audit. They attempted to remove them. I don't know if fully remove them, but maybe remove their contract pharmacies from the program while it was tightened up. And Genesis challenged this. They took HRSA to court and said that, what they're doing does meet what it says in the 340B statute, and that HRSA doesn't have the right to define that further. And ultimately, Genesis won that. So, while they, I guess, felt justified in that. That has been problematic for the larger covered entity universe in the 340B space, because that's not how most covered entities are managing their programs, and they don't necessarily feel that the patient definition is to be interpreted that loosely. So that definitely escalated the conversation between stakeholders of how covered entities are defining patients. And, even further, we recently had the court ruling, the Albany Med versus HRSA on the child site requirements. I talked about that recently in a different video that, back during the COVID time, HRSA had loosened up and said that, you can consider an offsite department 340B eligible before it is registered as a child site. That's part of this whole patient definition scope as well, because we talk, part of the patient definition is they're receiving care in an eligible site, and child sites have been a core element of defining what an eligible site is for a long time. And so during that time of flexibility, HRSA said this registration requirement doesn't necessarily have to happen before you consider an offsite department eligible. But then towards the end of, what we consider that pandemic period, when all of these flexibilities before the pandemic were being, taken back, that flexibility also was removed, and Albany Med challenged it, and I know many people wanted to challenge it because, again, that child site registration element is also not defined in the statute. So Albany Med was successful, and the court did say that, yeah, when HRSA doesn't necessarily have the authority. They can have this registration process. I do think that there's some value in that from a transparency aspect, but that can't be a driving factor in the 340B eligibility. So, that's another thing that we're now considering and is part of this patient definition conversation is, when you have an offsite department at a hospital, because this child site element is hospital specific, when can you consider this patient eligible in an offsite department? Based on that ruling, and we haven't heard anything since, there has to be more coming, but based on that, you don't have to wait until it's a registered child site. So, I spoke about in my other video, again, each covered entity needs to make sure that they're thinking about how they will define that. When are they going to consider offsite departments eligible? Maybe you still take the conservative route and follow that child site registration process. Maybe you feel justified in not having to do that, but we need to make sure we are thinking about, okay, but then what constitutes, when can I consider an offsite department eligible? When can I prove that it's, a hospital-based department integrated in, the services, integrated in the parent in the same way is, qualifying for the 340B program. So, that we just seem to have everything being decided in the courts lately, and at the state level too for the 340B program, which is just, it's challenging to navigate all of this and to really take it all in, and how do I apply this to my program? I just had a colleague reach out to me this week because we're in an open registration period, or actually as of today we're not, but April 1st through April 15th was an open registration period where you can register new child sites. And this colleague, reached out and said, I have someone I'm working with. They have a child site that they wanted to register, but they only have outpatient costs reported on the most recent cost report. There are not any charges specific to this department on, that roll up to the cost report, which I believe we've talked about that, but that's part of the registration process is for each department, or it could be a grouping of departments if they're all located in the same location, but when you're registering a new child site, some of the key elements are how that site rolls up to the hospital's cost report. So, what line of the cost report is related to, are those financials reported? And then specifically to this location, these services at that site they are trying to register, what are those outpatient costs and what are those outpatient charges that are, incorporated in that cost reporting? So my understanding is that you have always had to have both costs and charges to register a new child site. So, they were working through that. I don't know, like if you register, I've never tried to register a site with just costs and then putting in 0 for charges. That's definitely, if you're unsure what to do, like that's transparency to me, is you're just giving them all the information and then there'll be a back and forth with HRSA to see, if they approve it, if they have more questions, how that works. But, this new ruling is this going to if that entity cannot register that offsite department, can they still consider patients that are seen there eligible? Like, that's a really great question. I'm not claiming to have the answer. I kind of think yes, because, we haven't been given a new way to define when those offsite departments can be eligible. And if this covered entity is considering that offsite department to be, hospital-based and fully integrated in their parent hospital, then I think that it probably can be considered eligible. And, maybe it's a timing issue because, they're looking at the data from the most recently filed cost report. So let's say that they're on a calendar year, so their cost report ended December 31st of 25. Maybe they just didn't have charges before that day, but they have charges since then. So I feel that even further supports that, that entity could probably consider this department eligible eligible. But again, now that we're maybe living outside of a space where child site registration dictates eligibility, just make sure that as a covered entity that you're defining that process. And if you're audited by HRSA and you have these offsite departments that you're considering eligible before the registration, like, be able to defend that. You definitely need to, have it defined in your policies and procedures and be able to provide the supporting documentation to HRSA. So that was a little bit of a tangent, I guess, but still, I feel like it's an important part of the patient definition process or conversation. And, the other piece is just the reason, I guess the core reason of why I felt inspired to talk about this today is AbbVie's case. So I think it was April 8th, AbbVie filed a lawsuit against HRSA, stating that, they're challenging HRSA's longtime patient definition, which, they think is overly broad. They think it's outdated, enabling program abuse. I don't agree with those things. I think that HRSA's expectations of what they have been auditing it's not too broad. They are coming in. I've sat with auditors plenty of times with the Bazell group, like, they're coming in and they're validating that, not only do you have a patient record, but you have, like, this prescription is written in a site that's eligible, that the patient has had an encounter in, or, I'm not sure, I guess I can't say exactly like what that timeline is that HRSA is looking for, but, I think generally covered entities are within the 12 to 24 month. Probably more so the 24 month, that the patient needs to have an encounter within the last 24 months, that relates to that prescription. Because that's, I think, what the American Medical Association, they're defining a patient that you're seeing them, within 2 years. Again, it's probably not realistic for patients to be seen more often unless they truly need to be seen. Like, there's just not enough providers, and there's not enough time in the day for us to, have to be seeing our providers if we just don't have a reason to. So I think that 24-month range is pretty reasonable. And, if a covered entity feels justified in making it a little bit broader, maybe that's justified or reasonable as well. But that's what HRSA is doing. Like, they're coming in and looking for that. They're really validating these elements, even though it's not, again, it's not defined in the statute. But that expectation has been there for quite some time. I remember sitting through HRSA audits in 2015, where it was a very similar process. So, I don't think that HRSA's definition or their expectations are enabling abuse or overly broad. I just, again, maybe it seems that way because it's not, like, very well defined publicly. And I don't think, that HRSA necessarily has the authority to just truly, write a new rule or issue guidance. But, on this, I think that we would love, or I'll speak for myself. It would be nice to have some legislation. I think I've spoken before about the Sustained 340B Act that's been, in the works for the past, maybe 3 years at this point. We have a group of 6 senators that has been evolving a little bit. We've had a couple senators come and go, or more than a couple. But there's a strong group of people in the Senate that have been working on that legislation very mindfully and really taking, like, a very collaborative approach and taking feedback from all stakeholders. The last I knew, they were defining a patient similar to the American Medical Association, that, you need to have that care within 2 years. And there was language regarding child site registrations. I think that we would really benefit if we could get this type of legislation passed. I don't have much faith in the government actually being able to do that. But, if they are able to introduce that, and I think there's, some slow movement on the House side too, in the similar manner of, just building this very comprehensive legislation that if we could get this enacted into law, I think it would define a lot of this. It would take a lot of this guesswork out, hopefully take a lot of this, scrutiny that covered entities are just doing whatever they want. Like, they're not. But if we could just like really get this down on paper and in law, I think it would benefit us. This case, they say a lot of things. In this, AbbVie is proposing that the patient definition be, I guess, tightened so that the patient has to receive care within 12 months, which, is, I will say, not completely unreasonable, but again, it's not always feasible. I don't think that meets just the way the healthcare system works these days. They want a direct link between care and the prescription. They want that care to be something substantial, clinical care, not just superficial. And that provider responsibility to be, pretty well defined as well. So again, I don't take, like, it's not the worst case scenario of what they're asking for, but I think it's a bit too much. I don't think that would just, fit the care, the way that care is provided. There's discussion in this, lawsuit about duplicate discounts and diversion, diversion being 340B drug being provided to patients outside of that, patient definition, that, these covered entities are not responsible for the care. So I don't think that's the huge problem that some people think that it could be. But again, if we could just all have these terms defined, I think that would help. I don't think that's going to happen through this lawsuit. I can't see that the legal system is going to feel responsible for defining 340B laws. I think that they are likely going to kick this to legislation, to say that Congress needs to address this. Because I don't even know that they can kick this to HRSA. Because again, I don't know that HRSA has the authority to do this. But I'm not a legal expert, so that's certainly only my opinion. There's talk about program growth and all of that in the lawsuit as well, which actually have been working on pulling some data, some drug pricing data across, the last 6 to 10 years, and comparing that to program growth, and more to come on that. It's, I think some people on here watching know that I'm kind of a data nerd. I feel like the answers are in the data. Yes, we can say whatever we want. We can spin lots of things different ways, but the data tells the story. So I hope to have that ready to share with all of you soon. But, as of now, I guess we'll see how this progresses. Again, patient definition is super important. Make sure that we're, every covered entity is just doing the best that they can. That's what I always go back to. We control what we can. We cannot control all of these external forces that, are talking about program abuse or calling for change, calling for transparency. We can, whether we agree with some of those elements or not, I think the most important thing that we can do is understand as a covered entity how you are defining your patients. Make sure that the systems that you have in place are following how you define your patients. If you are working with a third-party administrator to manage your contract pharmacy business, make sure that if you say, okay, so I need this patient to have been seen within 24 months and this prescription that they capture needs to be related to that, make sure that that's how you have it set up to capture prescriptions in your third-party administrator, and audit that data and make sure that you can validate that, you're meeting your patient definition. It's just, that's again, I just go back to, as the best thing that we can do is make sure that we are responsible for our programs, because we want stability, we want sustainability in the program, and, one at a time, one covered entity at a time. I think that, we can do our part and just make sure that we're being the best steward of the program as we can. Advocate for what you think is right in the program, speak out, speak to your lawmakers. We have a lot of legislation going through at the state level. We're certainly dealing with that in New York State right now, and that's great. Those are great Band-Aids. But ideally, I hope we can get to a place where this is being addressed at a federal level and not, by the courts and at the state level, because I don't think that's doing much for, sustainability in the program. But I hope that you all found this helpful today. And more to come on all of these topics, because they're certainly never ending. And I will talk to you soon. Thanks, bye. Do you have a 340B compliance question? Send us a message at virtue340b.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you on the next episode for more expert 340B advice. Talk to you soon.